At the beginning of the movie, Dan appears nervous about taking a picture of Nam with an old camera. She asks what kind of camera could kill someone. Still hesitant, he delays clicking the photo until Nam yells at him. And as he presses the button, the scene abruptly cuts.
Comment. Subscribe to Recapss Horror.
Next, we see Dan meeting with his professor, who looks through some of his photos and asks why he chose him as his advisor. Dan explains that he wants to graduate with honors, to which the professor asks if he thinks this kind of work is worthy of honors. He adds that it would be embarrassing even to let him graduate, reminding him that he doesn't work for a fashion magazine. He selects artists. He then asks Dan if he is free on Sunday, and when Dan says yes, he tells him to come up with a new thesis topic, and they'll discuss it at his place. That night, Nam and Great surprise Dan on his birthday. Great gives him a projection flashlight that casts an image of him and Nam in their graduation gowns onto the wall. They urge Dan to stand in front of it to complete the picture, while Nam takes a few photos on her phone. Great then announces that they'll all be going to New York together. But Dan quietly reminds him that he hasn't graduated yet. Stunned, Great turns to Nam and asks, "You didn't tell him?" And Nam stays silent. She then tells Dan that she and Great have been accepted, and Great adds that they need to be there next month. Dan replies that if he passes his project, he'll receive a scholarship to join them, so they can all go together. Hearing this, Great and Nam are overjoyed, and the three of them begin celebrating. At home, Dan gets a call from his mother, asking if he is coming to his uncle's birthday next week. When he declines, she reminds him that his uncle paid for his tuition, and may not have much time left. She also notes his friends have graduated and asks if he'll graduate this year. The next day, Dan visits Professor Aim's house, where Prang greets him, saying the professor often talks about him and rarely invites students home, so he must be working hard. While Dan is looking at a painting, the professor asks if he likes it. Dan asks who painted it, and Aim replies that he did, for next month's faculty exhibition. He explains that it was his own graduation project, once displayed at the Tillman Gallery in New York. Dan's eyes widen at the mention of New York, prompting the professor to scoff and remark that Dan always gets excited whenever he mentions the city. Dan then tells him that his topic is proof, saying he wants to tell the stories of underdogs who strive to prove themselves to the world, just like him, and that he plans to use his old camera for the project. Aim asks what's so special about it, and Dan replies that his mother bought it for him when he was in grade 8. Nowadays, he admits, he isn't sure why people still take photos if not to capture meaningful moments or good memories. Aim then shares that when he was studying in New York, he focused on taking photos every day, but in the end, they all felt ordinary, until the day he got this particular camera. He explains that he used it for his final project, adding that once their work becomes sought after, they gain the freedom to do whatever they want. Dan picks it up, and Aim says that if he passes this project within the next 14 days, he promises to nominate him for the New York Scholarship. Next, Dan heads to the field to photograph a group of athletes, but as he lifts his camera and focuses on one particular athlete, Bomb, a white fog appears on his face. He quickly shifts the lens toward the other athletes, only to find them captured in perfect, crystal clear detail. After the race, Dan raises his camera to capture more shots of Bomb, but he sees a girl standing in the stands who vanishes the next moment. Next, Nam notices Dan's camera and curiously asks about it, to which Dan explains that Professor Aim gave it to him. Then, almost hesitantly, he asks if she likes his work, to which Nam says she does like his work, but she likes him even more. Later, Great visits an antique store, where the owner, Raj, tells him about the Stone of Life from Russia, and when Great asks what it does, Raj explains that it can capture souls, and that Westerners use it to ward off demons. He then shows Great a bracelet made of white rose quartz, saying it's meant for young women. Raj adds that if someone is angry with you, give them the stone, and their anger will fade. Great gives the bracelet to Nam, and she asks if he's hitting on her. Great asks if he's allowed, but she quickly clarifies that there's nothing between them. Great apologizes for what he did in the past, and admits that he still loves her. He says he just wants to know if there's any chance they could ever get back together. To which she asks him to imagine if she had messed around with another man, claimed she was drunk, and then handed him a bracelet as an apology. He asks if she likes Dan now, and when she remains silent, Great grows angry, but Nam tells him he has no right to be mad at her. He places the bracelet on the dashboard, saying she should just keep it since it's expensive. That night, Bomb's coach tells him he was a bit behind today and urges him to work harder tomorrow. After the coach leaves, Bomb opens his locker and looks at a picture of his daughter. He then takes out his medals and studies them in silence. Suddenly, he hears a noise behind him, and turning toward the fans, he realizes the sound isn't coming from there. Meanwhile, Dan develops Bomb's photos in the darkroom, the images slowly surfacing under the dim red light. At that same moment, Bomb feels an unsettling presence creeping close, and his face hardens with sudden anger. Then, in the mirror, his reflection is seen laughing at him, and in the very next instant, his lifeless body dangles from the ceiling fan. The next morning, as Dan steps out of his building, he notices a homeless man there, watching him with hollow eyes. Dan raises his camera and snaps a photo before he walks away. Later, Dan shows Bomb's photos to Professor Aim, who studies them carefully and tells Dan that he is on the right track, saying, "It's as if he has captured his very soul." He then tells Dan to bring him more photos like this. Dan visits a restaurant that has been around for over 50 years, known as the #1 spot in the area and the most famous of its kind. The owner explains that the restaurant has been in their family for 3 generations, and that it is both their home and their identity. Dan takes her photo, and as he turns to photograph her husband, a woman suddenly appears, startling him. When Nam notices his reaction and asks what's wrong, Dan brushes it off. Nam then mentions that she remembers Jan once used this same camera. Dan asks, "Jan? The one who died from a heart attack?" And Nam confirms. Just then, she receives a call from Great, who delivers shocking news, and she tells Dan that Bomb has taken his own life. Later, Great asks Nam if she doesn't think Bomb's death seems suspicious, saying that Bomb was disabled, so how could he have reached the beam? Later, Nam looks through Jan's social media profile and finds a post that reads, "I just want it to be over." She then checks Rin's profile, where she comes across a post saying, "If you hadn't been so obsessed with the thesis, we would still be together." She calls Rin and asks if she's free tomorrow, explaining that she has some questions about Jan. The next day, Dan is at the hospital for his uncle's birthday, who asks Dan what he is studying, and he replies, "Photography." The uncle then taunts Dan's mother, Tayu, saying it's just like when she started learning piano and quit. He becomes furious and says it's hard, but she didn't give it all, and that's why she failed. Turning to Dan, he tells him that both he and his mother are holding the family back, and adds, "If you want to be the best, you have to give it everything." After a while, Uncle blows out the candle on his cake and tells Dan to take his photo, saying, "Let's see how good you really are." Dan pulls Professor Aim's camera from his bag and lifts it to take the shot, but then stops and says, "Mom's not here, and let him go get her first." He goes to his mother, who tells him that what his uncle said is true, saying if he wants to succeed, he must dedicate himself fully, but he also needs time for other aspects of life. She then leaves to meet his uncle, while Don notices a girl nearby playing the piano. Intrigued, he raises his camera and begins taking her pictures, but after a few shots, he sees the restaurant owners. He approaches them, but they suddenly lunge at him, and Dan jolts awake. Suddenly, he senses someone watching him, and turning around, he sees a smoky figure leaving the room. Meanwhile, Nam goes to the stadium, where she finds Bomb's coach, who tells her that he's there to collect Bomb's belongings. She asks what happened, and he explains that athletes with high expectations are always under pressure, but he never thought Bomb would take his own life. She asks if Bomb had seemed depressed or troubled in any way, and the coach replies that not to his knowledge. He adds that Bomb was extremely ambitious, so much so that some of his teammates didn't like him, and he can't imagine Bomb making a decision like that. Meanwhile, Dan dreams of the restaurant owner attacking her husband with a chopper, striking him repeatedly until he dies. Suddenly, the man revives, attacks her, and she falls down the stairs to her death. Dan suddenly sits up in shock, and his eyes fall on Professor Aim's camera lying in front of him. Dan visits the professor and admits he wonders if there's something strange about the camera, explaining that one of the people he photographed has died. The professor asks, "And you knew him?" And when Dan says no, the professor says everyone dies eventually, but the real question is how they live while they're still alive. Dan insists that he wants to give it his all, and the professor tells him, "Then take these photos for me, and I'll make the world accept you." Meanwhile, Nam meets Rin, who gives her Jane's notebook, telling her to take a look and see what she can find. Nam asks if Jan had shown any symptoms, like feeling unwell or acting strangely, to which Ryan explains that Jan often seemed sluggish and in poor health. She says she even told her to see a doctor, but Jan refused, and she was completely obsessed with her thesis. In a flashback, Jan enters her room when an eerie entity suddenly passes in front of her, causing her to collapse to the floor in terror. Trembling, she looks around but sees nothing, until the entity suddenly drags her away. Rin tells Nam that Jan used to be full of energy and very confident, but once she started working on her thesis, it was as if she became completely consumed by it. Meanwhile, Great introduces Dan to Porch, their funding source, who created the Pick Me app that makes photos look like film without a studio. He also tells him about Minnie, connected to celebrities and highly skilled, and 10, the brains, who can make anything happen. Dan remarks that the rich can do whatever they want, but when life comes too easily, there's nothing worth fighting for. So what's the point of living? At the same time, Nam discovers the restaurant is closed, and when she tries to call Dan, his number is unreachable. She then calls Great and asks if Dan is off work. Great tells her that Dan left after finishing, and when she asks which camera he used, Great replies that it was the digital one. She meets Great and tells him that the camera is killing people. She then opens Jane's MacBook and discovers that she had been reading the Satanic Bible. Great calls Dan and asks if he has sent the photos, to which Dan replies that he's still developing them and abruptly disconnects the call. When Nam asks what happened, Great explains that Dan said Porch told him to use the film camera and that he just developed the photos. Meanwhile, the entity takes control of Minnie, 10, and Porch, and without hesitation, the three of them leap from the rooftop together, plunging to their deaths. Sometime later, Great and Nam arrive, only to be confronted with a scene of pure horror. The next day, Great tells Dan that 10, Porch, and Minnie jumped off a building and died. Nam adds that both owners of the restaurant also died, and Great says he thinks the camera is cursed. Dan asks if he is saying the camera kills people, and Great replies that he doesn't know, but something about it isn't right. Nam then reveals that Jan had used the same camera, and not only did she die, but so did the 3 people she photographed. Just then, Dan gets a call from his mother, and as he steps aside to answer, Nam quietly takes the camera out of his bag. Dan notices and asks what she's planning to do with it, and Nam replies that she's going to ask his professor about it. They visit Professor Aim, where Nam asks if he knows about the deaths of Jan and Malin, and how he got this camera, to which Aim calmly replies that he lent the camera to Jan, and it belongs to him. Nam tells him that Dan has used this camera on 6 people, and all of them are now dead, to which Aim asks if she's saying the camera can kill people. When they remain silent, he tells Nam to take his picture and see if he dies. Nam reluctantly lifts the camera, but Aim suddenly stops her, only to remove his glasses and adjust his hair, and when she raises it again, her eyes widen in horror, seeing the painting behind him swirling unnaturally. Aim asks why she isn't taking the photo, then steps aside, casually suggesting that maybe the film has run out. Great asks her what's wrong, but Nam is too shaken to respond, and without another word, she hurries out of the room. Great follows her and asks what happened, but Nam asks Dan, didn't he see it? Dan says no, to which Nam insists that he must have seen something, and they need to throw the camera away, but Dan takes the camera from her. Dan then visits the hospital, and we learn that during that call, his mother had told him that his uncle is in a coma and may not survive the night. Dan thanks his uncle for everything he has done for him. In a flashback, it's revealed that AIM had told Dan he only had 5 days to submit his work, and that he just needed to take one more photo. Dan lifts his camera to capture his uncle's picture, and the moment he presses the button, his uncle dies. Later, Dan reviews the photos he took with the camera, and realizing the wrong he has done, he angrily tears them all apart. In a fit of frustration, he hurls the camera at a mirror, shattering it into pieces. Afterward, he begins laughing maniacally, but suddenly a sharp pain strikes his chest, and he collapses, unconscious. After some time, he wakes when Nam calls, but he ignores it, and when he looks around, he is horrified to see the cursed camera still resting untouched on the table. Frustrated, he rushes to the roof and hurls it away, but soon he feels weak, as if the energy is being drained from his body. Just then, Prang appears at his house and asks if he's okay. Shocked, he asks how she knew he was there, but she only presses him about what happened, and if he's all right. She says she found something that might belong to him. Suddenly, her face twists into a demonic form, and Dan jolts awake, realizing it was just a nightmare. But to his horror, the camera is still there, lying intact on the table. Overwhelmed by everything, Dan decides to end his life. But just as he's about to, his phone buzzes with a notification, making him pause. He checks and sees a message from a model named Cake, asking about his photography rates, and Dan replies that he'll do it for free, agreeing to meet her tomorrow. The next day, Cake arrives at Dan's studio for the photo shoot, and, with trembling hands, he sets up the cursed camera to take her photos, but just as he's about to press the shutter, Nam walks in and firmly tells Cake to leave. Once she's gone, Nam turns to Dan and says, "Looking for a model? Then take a photo of me." Nam taunts him, asking what he's so afraid of, insisting there's nothing wrong with the camera before asking, what kind of camera could kill people? Dan's breath grows ragged, his trembling hands barely able to hold the cursed device as his finger hovers over the shutter. But just as he is about to press the button, Dan hurls the camera, and at that same instant, AIM is seen with demonic eyes. Dan collapses to his knees, tears streaming down his face as he confesses to Nam that he never meant to kill them. Great steps forward, his expression calm yet heavy with understanding. He kneels beside Dan, placing a steady hand on his shoulder, and assures him that everything will be okay, and they are in this together. Later, Nam shows them the last website John visited, and Great asks if the painting on the site is the same one they saw at Professor Aim's house. Just then, Dan's attention shifts to a homeless man outside, and he asks if they can see the man too. And when Nam says yes, Dan admits that he once took his picture. He rushes to his lab and tells them that the homeless man and the girl didn't die. And as they look through the photos, Nam points out that these are the only 2 where their eyes aren't visible, unlike the others who died, whose eyes can clearly be seen. They visit the antique shop, where Raj warns them that demons often manifest in unexpected forms. He asks if they've heard the belief that cameras capture souls, that some are even used to kill, sacrificing souls to demons. Nam asks if the painting is connected to this, and Dan reveals that Professor Aim is displaying it at the exhibition. Raj then asks if they believe in satanic cults, explaining that whoever possessed this painting was once the most powerful. According to legend, 7 souls must be sacrificed, and if the number falls short, the camera owner must give up their own soul. Horrified, Great asks if there's anything they can do, to which Raj replies that tomorrow the gates of hell will open and demons will claim their sacrifices. He hands them a bracelet, warning Dan to never take it off, as it can protect against demons. Then, turning to Great, he asks if he still has the stone he gave him, and when Great shakes his head, Raj says it can protect him. Later, Great asks Dan what they'll do if Aim is really a demon, and how they can fight him, to which Dan pulls the cursed camera from his bag and tells his friends that it's time to give him a taste of his own medicine. As the exhibition begins, Dan attempts to photograph Aim, but can't get a clear shot. Great steps forward to clear the path, and Dan tries again, but Prang stops him, asking why he doesn't join them inside, to which Dan replies that he'll be there shortly. After she leaves, Great signals him, and Dan makes another attempt. But in every photo, Aim's eyes refuse to meet the camera, until, after some time, Dan finally manages to capture a shot. They return to the lab, and Dan develops Aim's photo, only to find that his eyes are closed. Just then, Nam notices another photo that looks unclear, and when Dan takes it out, they are shocked to see a reflection of Great staring directly at the camera. Later, Great suddenly screams in terror, claiming he saw a huge creature right in front of his face. Dan quickly takes out his bracelet and slips it onto Great's wrist, instantly calming him. Nam glances at the clock and warns Dan that he has less than an hour left, but Dan points out that Great is still alive. Nam asks what that could mean and whether there could be other factors, to which Dan responds that he believes Raj's amulet might be the real protection. Dan goes to the gallery and stands in front of the painting, but as he is about to click his own picture, Aim asks why he is doing this, and doesn't he want to go to New York? Dan says he is submitting his project, saying it's just one more person and let it be him. Aim asks if he knows what's going to happen if he does this. He tells him, "Don't be stupid," saying just one more step. Dan says, "Yes, just one more step." And when Aim asks what he is waiting for, Dan says for him to get in the frame. He then presses the shutter, but Aim turns his face away. Dan quickly tries to click him again, but Aim hides his eyes and says he is disappointed in him. Dan turns to a mirror and clicks his reflection's photo, but Aim asks if he can develop it in time. Dan runs from the gallery, but Aim's eyes turn demonic once again, and Prang appears beside him. Dan quickly grabs the film and joins his friends, but before they can leave, they notice Minnie lying in the doorway. Suddenly, her body convulses violently, and to their horror, she reveals her demonic self. She then crawls up the wall in a grotesque, unnatural manner, and then advances toward them like a spider. Terrified, they manage to slip into a room, but are immediately horrified to see the fan from which Bomb had hanged himself. Suddenly, Bomb's ghost grabs Dan's leg and knocks him to the floor. Great quickly snatches a nearby object, striking Bomb's apparition to push it back. The three climb the stairs and are confronted by the restaurant owner's ghost, and Dan tells Great to take Nam away. Her husband's ghost appears and drags Dan back, but he dodges the attack, and when the woman seizes his neck, Dan fights back and shoves her down the stairs. Nam and Great manage to reach the main gate, only to find it locked. Just then, they hear the sound of a door opening, and when they turn around, they are horrified to see the shadow of a demonic figure descending the stairs, who turns out to be Prang, but by the time Nam and Great have already left the area. Meanwhile, Dan hides in a theater, crawling between the seats, when Bomb suddenly lunges at him, and as he scrambles to escape, the ghosts of Minnie, Ten, and Porch drop down around him. Horrified, Dan tries to flee, only to come face to face with Ten's ghost. Meanwhile, Great and Nam are hiding in a bathroom when Prang suddenly starts banging on the door, trying to force it open. But after a few moments, she retreats. Nam whispers, "Is it gone?" And Great says he don't know. He puts his ear to the door when suddenly, Prang attacks the door with an axe, making a hole in it, and they watch in horror as she tries to enter. But Great reacts quickly and kicks the door. Dan rushes out and runs into the ghosts of Ten and Minnie. As he turns to escape, Bomb's ghost blocks him, and the restaurant owners attack, knocking him to the ground. Great battles Prang, striking her with the camera, but she hurls him aside with terrifying force, and as Nam helps him to his feet, Prang grabs the axe and swings at them. Great narrowly dodges and urges Nam to run, but Prang hurls the axe at him, causing him to fall, and his bracelet slips from his wrist. Great sees that his eyes have turned pitch black, and a strange transformation begins. As he struggles to rise, Prang raises the axe again, but Nam pulls him back, only for his protective stone to be struck and fall to the ground. Great gets up and turns to Nam, trying to strangle her, as she tries to remind him that it's her. But just as Nam's strength begins to fade, the stone flares to life, its glow cutting through the shadows, and it begins to pull violently, the darkness consuming Great and Prang. Meanwhile, Dan is cornered by the swarm of ghosts when the stone drags the spirits toward it, and one after another, their twisted forms are sucked into the light. As Dan staggers to his feet, a guttural roar echoes through the hall, followed by the thunder of heavy, clawed footsteps, and his eyes widen in terror as a massive, rat-like demon crawls out. Dan stumbles backward, heart racing, until the creature lunges at him, causing him to crash to the floor. Dan desperately gets up, only for the demon to seize him and slam him against the wall, dragging him along the surface with a sickening screech before hurling him across the room like a rag doll. As the demon advances, Dan crawls frantically across the floor until he freezes. Standing calmly in his path is Professor Aim, who says, 2 minutes past midnight. "Your time is up." He then crouches closer and says, he can help him. Just give him the film. Dan tries to flee, but Aim's voice echoes through the air, asking what he's trying to do. He reminds him that he only needs to kill one more to get what he wants. Suddenly, Aim appears before him, and Dan notices the demon approaching him from behind. Dan mutters, "You're right, just one more, and that one will be me." He then turns toward the demon, charges straight at it, and leaps into its gaping mouth. Dan finds himself in another world, where Aim greets him with a mocking clap, calling him so heroic. Aim praises his bravery, but asks if he really thinks this will end everything. He reminds Dan of the people who sacrificed and supported him. Suddenly, Dan's mother appears, telling him she knows he's different from her and urging him not to let go of his dream. Great then steps forward, reminding him of their promise to go to New York together. Finally, Nam calls out to Dan, pleading with him to do it for her so they can be together. Moved, Dan extends the film toward Nam, who smiles and says he finally understands. She takes the film from him, and it is revealed that Dan had secretly swapped it, already giving the original film to Nam beforehand. Aim admits, "You always surprise me, but your time is over." Meanwhile, Nam and Great begin developing the real film, and the moment Aim's picture appears, a portal to another world rips open and drags Aim into it. After some time, Nam and Great arrive at the gallery, only to find Dan lying lifeless on the floor. They desperately try to wake him, and Nam presses her ear to his chest, but when she hears no heartbeat, they fear they've lost him. In a flashback, Dan tells Nam and Great to take care of themselves in New York, and Dan says he is grateful to have them in his life. He then asks, "What's the meaning of its brand?" To which Dan answers, "Our lives." And suddenly, Dan gasps for breath and awakens. Next, we see the camera with Dan, and a woman asks if he wants her to look at it. Dan raises the camera to take the picture, and the movie ends there.